Okay, we have our last panel of the day, and I think it's sort of brings us from broad to a little bit more narrow, and now we're back to sort of broader. And what we thought about broader is bringing in people that are not necessarily in water companies or working for water utilities, people that are working outside of what is so-called the water world, to come and talk about how they view water and how central water is to their businesses. So we have assembled quite a distinguished group of individuals today from a broad section of industries. We're going to have Andrew Isle, who will be moderating the panel, who's the head of climate risk North America at Tata Consulting. We have a mayor from MRCTI, the mayors of the Mississippi River, who's from the city of La Crosse, Wisconsin. Mayor Mitch Reynolds here. We have Amy Barnes, who is the head of climate and sustainability and strategy at Marsh. We have Raghuveer Vinukollu, who is the head of climate insights and advisory at Munich Re, and has been analyzing the various climate risks in the insurance industry. And we have John Fascitelli, who's the chief executive officer at Harris Blitzer Real Estate and Development, who is coming at it from a real estate perspective. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Andrew, who will lead us for the next 45 minutes on water outside of utilities. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Alex. Really appreciate that introduction. And as you said, we're, for this section, going to explore some perspectives of subnational entities, cities and regions, as well as various corners of the private sector and industry, and what they think about when they think about water and what some of these practical issues look like actually at the ground level. So I'd like to just frame this discussion a little bit by picking up two threads that I think we'll likely see in this panel. One is thinking about water as a scarce resource, one that is increasingly dear and that requires more thinking and planning around its management. We already heard earlier today about groundwater issues and how there is increasing scarcity around groundwater, as well as other sources that tend to have been taken perhaps for granted to a degree that is no longer the case. On the other side of the coin, we have water as a transmission pathway for natural disasters and climate-related challenges. And so we see extreme weather and other extreme events being a real challenge that both business and municipalities are dealing with to an unprecedented degree. To that end, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has identified 371 billion-dollar climate disasters since 1980. In the 90s and 2000s, we saw them at a clip of about 6 per decade. As of September, or early September this year, we've seen 18 of them in the US. And so that gives you a sense of how rapidly this issue is growing. Many of those are storms. I'm sorry, we have 23 of them, 18 of which are storms. We have a wildfire. We haven't even gotten that far into hurricane season yet. And so many of these are water related and are impacting industry, impacting the insurance and financial sector, and impacting the public sector. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mayor Reynolds to share with us his perspective as the leader of a municipality and also one of the leading representatives of a group of municipalities in the Mississippi River Valley. And Mr. Mayor, I'd love to hear your perspective on water and what you think about when you think about water. Okay, thank you, Andrew. I appreciate you being here, and thank you to Columbia University as well as Science for inviting us here. I not only represent La Crosse, Wisconsin, but also the national co-chair of Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiative, or MRCTI. I address concerns of the Mississippi River corridor and represent 104 mayors along the corridor, from Bemidji to, down to Gretna, Louisiana, and all points in between. And so we are looking at water resources and challenges of the Mississippi River on a system-wide basis, which is really how we have to do it.
And it's easy for me to look out, when I think of water, I think about it's easy for me to look out my backyard and think, well, I've got to do something about fill in the blank, how I can protect myself against flooding, or how I can protect my community against flooding, or how I can ensure that there is navigable waterways just outside my door. But that's not how the Mississippi River works. The Mississippi River works in a way that is impactful not only up and down the corridor, but globally as well. And when you think about just the sheer numbers of how commerce on the Mississippi impacts the globe, we're talking 1 in 12 people on the planet consume commodities that are shipped via the Mississippi River. 40% of agricultural products from the United States of America are exported via the Mississippi River. It is the most significant river basin on the planet. And as such, we need to act systemically. And so when I think about the Mississippi River as a natural resource, I think about that as a system-wide thing. And what we are trying to do at MRCTI is, what we are doing is we're functioning as an organization to ensure the viability and long-term sustainability of the Mississippi River as a natural resource. And we're doing that in a number of different ways. And it's funny because Dr. Lull said this morning we have to do something. Well, we're doing something. And one of the things that we're doing is we're looking at deploying natural infrastructure. And one of the very things that was addressed at the opening this morning, deploying natural infrastructure up and down the Mississippi River for floodwater storage. And we have, we're working in concert with, for instance, Ducks Unlimited to be able to deploy this infrastructure. And it's an extraordinary private partnership that we're involved in, our subnational group along with this private organization, to engineer these projects in various places down the river. We have projects that are ready to go, that are shovel ready to go right at this very moment. And what these do is, you talked about going from a narrow discussion to a broad discussion. If I get too broad, I'll just sit here for 2 hours and talk about this stuff. So I'm not going to do that. I'm going to let these other folks have a couple minutes. Maybe just a couple, but I'm trying to be beneficent here. So. What we are attempting to do is find a way to moderate the flow of the Mississippi River, because floods are significant. Right now, drought is much more significant of a challenge for the Mississippi River, and and it has impacts in so many different ways. We talk so much about fresh water, right? Our drinking water and wastewater. Well, drinking water and wastewater are both things that are part of living along the Mississippi River. There are 20 million people who dip their straws into the Mississippi River for drinking water. Everything that occurs up and down the Mississippi River impacts those 20 million people. So when we have low water levels because of drought, it's challenging for those communities to pull water from the Mississippi River. As one, I don't remember where this was, one public works facilities manager said somewhere along the river, it's like, I can't suck mud through a straw. And so we have to consider how we can impact the river all the way up where I'm at in La Crosse, Wisconsin, and how that impacts or how that benefits those communities on the lower Mississippi. And so these natural infrastructure floodwater storage projects that we're looking at will help us do that by moderating water flow. They act as sponges. So in the periods of high water, we can limit the flow of the water down the river, so we can limit flooding in places like Dubuque, Iowa, Davenport, Iowa, East St. Louis, that kind of thing. In times of drought, these backwater areas or these flood storage areas, they moderate the flow so that there is, we don't lose all of the water all at once, if you will. I'm simplifying because that's what I am. I'm a mayor. I simplify things. All y'all are sitting there going, man, there are words for that guy? Come on. So this is kind of the things that we're focused on as an organization, and I think that, and we have to think of this system-wide, because the things that I do with it, that I can do outside my community, or more to the point, in my community, I actually have a floodwater storage area within the city of La Crosse. It's a 1,000-acre marsh, and we just went through the third highest flood on record this past spring, and we experienced virtually no damage within our city because of it, because we have this flood water storage area within our city that can store that water so that that moderates the outflow. And so we've proven that this concept works in the process, and now it's it's deploying that, getting it going from concept and plan and to deployment. You know, frankly, and Raghuveer is here, and you know, one of the things that we're looking at is how to ensure these resources as well, or ensure this infrastructure, and that's where you know, we're working on this, and he can explain it better than I can, but a reinsurance process so that we can engage the global commodity markets in basically helping to pay to ensure these infrastructures areas against damage. I'm going to give back the time because I want to let this panel move on. But I think that as a general focus from our organization as MRCTI, first of all, it's system-wide improvements, and it's also making certain that we are doing exactly what we should do, is letting nature be the part of the solution for what we're addressing with floods and drought.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Very vivid, I think, portrayal of how these water management issues for both flood and drought are really day-to-day, real-life concerns for people in the Mississippi River Valley. Raghuveer, I wanted to turn to you to expand a little bit on, first of all, the role of reinsurance in helping to bring about the infrastructure that's necessary to manage these issues around flood and drought, and how does a reinsurer enter into you know, collaboration with the other stakeholders here, and what is the role of natural infrastructure in helping to manage these water flows?
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. So first of all, good afternoon, and really excited to be here, and especially in a week, climate week. And when I hear Mayor Reynolds talk about systemic change required, I think this was some of the discussions that we have been hearing, at least in the last 2 days, and I'm sure there will be a few more conversations. I myself, I call myself as a displaced hydrologist in the reinsurance industry. So what does a displaced hydrologist do? His mind is saturated with the topic of flood. Well, just a little pun intended there. So as a reinsurer, what's our role is really, in short, I mean, you might have heard that we insure the insurance companies, but that's a simplistic way of putting it. But really, behind the scenes, we are really a sonar scanner looking 10 years down the lane, 20 years down the lane, trying to understand what are the signals that we can capture and try to understand what would change. So for example, the best example I can give is if the autonomous cars was something that you heard in 2016 or 17, we probably as an industry saw those cars in 2011. So it's kind of like we are always ahead of the curve, trying to understand the risks that are out there in the real world. And try to come up with solutions that would fit the need of the society. So from a flood perspective, I think it really, I mean, Andrew, you gave some really good numbers in terms of 2023. So let me put it in the context of flooding, how that has impacted the globe. Let's start with that. It's been $1 trillion of losses since 1980, just flooding. Right, and that's just a really big number, but it impacts everyone. There is not a region across the world that is not prone to flooding. Let's bring it to the U.S. I think the Mississippi River Valley, from 2005 till 2018, almost excluding the coastal states of Louisiana and Mississippi, I would say the number was about $100 billion of losses, and a significant portion was flooding. And then come to 2019. This is an year of really historic proportion flooding over the Mississippi River. $25+ billion of losses, just economic losses. Now let's just assume if that is the number, what would the insured losses be? That was really, really low, which was at $200 million. That was our estimate from Munich Re, NatCat Service. So what does that mean? That means the protection gap in these communities is really, really high, which means the difference between the economic losses and the insured losses is really big. So the take-up rate of insurance, especially for flood, is pretty low. I mean, that is kind of consistent with what we see across the US, which is about 5 to 6% of homeowners actually have flood insurance. So it really comes down to, in the Mississippi River Valley, we think it's around less than 0.5% people actually were insured. So what are the solutions? From that perspective, Munich Re, we started looking at the signals, and one particular paper I like to highlight is that by the Climate Policy Initiative. It was on building resiliency across cities and public entities. And one of the things that they mentioned and kind of which highlighted, at least got our attention, was that these cities and public entities are getting they're facing the brunt of all these disasters, and now they are starting to update the infrastructure. And so now, how are they making those decisions? It's great to have the latest science and the data to captured from like NASA and NOAA, but then what they were really not looking at least the cities were not looking at, is what's the impact of that decision making? Okay, it's the flood wall that's going to be built. What's the impact of that on the communities that are living across? And is this decision making in terms of a benefit cost analysis being factored in? So, and that's something which some of the Florida communities, some of the Virginia communities, and California communities, they're starting to look in. So that's how we started engaging with these communities. But one important stakeholder, what we found, was the MRCTI, the Mississippi River Cities and Towns Initiatives, and the mayor mentioned all the work that has been done. I mean, I think it's really I mean, in my PhD, I always thought that the Mississippi River was like the center of attraction for me because of all the analysis that I did. But then when I kind of started attending these meetings, where I've really understood the importance of this river. And Mayor, you mentioned about the 40% of the exports, agricultural exports, more than that is. So I think what we really understood was, like, there is a dire need for some of these solutions, like innovative solutions, to be deployed here. So we were like, okay, well, what's really needed if these communities? So we started interviewing some of the mayors across the river, and it was really, really amazing or not amazing, but really interesting to hear that the way the structure works in terms of the disaster recovery, some insurance solutions can be fit in, and we tried to bring in some of the international experience, like the Caribbean islands putting together a risk pool together. So we started saying, okay, can that be deployed over the Mississippi River, where all the cities can put together a risk pool so that they cross-subsidize the risk? So not every city, not a section of the cities will, not every city across the Mississippi River will flood every year, but a section of the river will flood almost every year or every other year. So can they actually put together a risk pool to again, cross-subsidize and get certain amount of cash flow for emergency response or any other activity that's needed while the event is happening or right after the event. So these are solutions that exist across the world in terms of parametric insurance as an innovative solution. But then, as Munich Re, we also start thinking about, okay, we want to deploy a solution, but we want to make sure that it is sustainable over time. And sustainability means that we don't have to deploy a solution and have to pull out just because the risk went high, right? So that is very, very important for a reinsurer like Munich Re. So we started thinking, okay, how can we actually also help in risk mitigation? Because ultimately, risk mitigation will be significant for addressing climate risk. So that's when the natural infrastructure aspect of it came in, and some of the conversations with like organizations like the Ducks Unlimited and the Nature Conservancy, we started saying, all right, how can we see the impacts of it? And so one such study was quickly, I'm sorry, I don't know, one more minute, and I'll give back to you, Andrew. So one such study was over the Missouri River, where we found the Army Corps did a levee setback, which is a nature-based solution. And when we saw the impact of that levee setback, because it improves the standard of protection of the levee, the impact of that on 1,500 homes in that region was about 65% reduction in premium of all of those homes combined, of course. Now, not all of those homes had insurance. So we have to start thinking about community-based solutions. But then, again, it's a systemic-wide reduction in risk that we have to think about. So we started working with these organizations and say, all right, what's the impact of nature-based solutions on a watershed scale? But again, let's start now thinking about one more step higher level, which is bringing in mitigation, climate mitigation and adaptation together. So now starting to think about carbon credits. These nature-based solutions are also generating carbon credits, but at the same time, if we strategize properly, then we can also reduce the risk of flooding as well as extreme heat. But again, we have to start thinking about these solutions at a much bigger scale over the entire watershed. So that's where we are. I think that I'll give it back to you, Andrew. Hopefully that generates a few questions. But
all right. Well, thank you, Raghuveer. You laid a lot of breadcrumbs for us, and I know you're going to do a mic drop because you have to run to another event. So I don't know if that's our good fortune or our curse to have to pick up all those pieces that you've left for us. But I think it should be good food for thought here. So thank you so much for that. So a lot to unpack there. Amy, maybe I can turn to you now because, as I understand it, you and I have in common that we see a lot of these water-related issues through a climate change lens. And I think so much of what Raghuveer was just saying actually is really magnified by climate or really affected by climate. You have the protection gap, you have issues of infrastructure that uses natural features, nature-based solutions, and then you've got the fact that a lot of these threats are really exacerbated by climate change. Could you share a little bit about your perspective and sort of what is your thought bubble as Raghuveer was sort of unpacking that for us?
Thank you. No, I really appreciate the opportunity. And before Raghuveer goes, I will introduce myself in a second, but I know you have to dash. I would reframe one of the comments around flood insurance, people not taking it up. For many communities, it's just not available. And so it's not just electing not to buy, it's not having the availability there in the first place, I think, and that's part of the protection gap we need to address. So Amy Barnes, I'm Head of Climate and Sustainability Strategy for Marsh, and for those that don't know you, we're a risk and insurance advisor. So while Raghuveer is on the reinsurance side, so supporting the insurance community and public sector, we tend to be dealing directly with corporates. And so my experience is very corporate, and I'm very conscious that a lot of the themes I'm going to talk about impact people, communities and homes in really significant ways, but my focus is going to be very much direct at corporates. So when we think about water, we think about it in a number of ways. Think about it as a resource, and I think that's been what a lot of the topics this morning have been covered. But primarily, we think about it as a source of damage. And thinking about floods' potential to cause harm, which Raghuveer talked about, which I think there is a massive insurance protection gap. Our statistics show that only 17% of economic cost of floods globally is insured. 17%. Now that's tiny. Now that's looking across all economies, from developed economies through to emerging markets. But it shows that there's a massive economic loss that's not being protected against. See it as infrastructure, which is a lot of what Mayor Reynolds was talking about, and thought you might be interested in one of our clients, an aviation client. They're not worried about getting products out the Mississippi River, but they take glycol up the Mississippi River to their airports. And so they had an issue last winter when the Mississippi was also in drought, being able to de-ice their aircraft. So an industry that's trying to decarbonize can no longer use the river, which we really like from a climate perspective, because it's a low-carbon means of transport, and suddenly needs to use semis and railroad cars with a higher carbon footprint. So the failure of trade goes both ways. So resource damage, infrastructure, and then finally, which I won't really talk much about, a source of liability. pollution of water as a resource. I will say just that there's a lot of regulation, especially in Europe, that has started to think about protecting biodiversity. And so to the extent that corporate cause harm to water, there can be some really significant legal liabilities, obviously in the US, but I think even more so in Europe. So if I focus on damage, which is where insurance tends to really drill down, water has the potential to damage not just owned property, but also the supply chain and the dependent infrastructure. But damage itself isn't always the biggest consequence. It's the financial cost of the damage. So not the repair, but the business interruption. You may have seen that VW have had to halt production of all VW motors for several weeks due to floods in, I can't remember if it's Slovenia or Slovakia. I feel very un-European at the moment. Slovenia or Slovakia had really bad flooding, and VW have had to stop production. Thank you. If you want to buy a Toyota pickup truck in Europe at the moment, Toyota pickup trucks in Europe are made in South Africa, and there is over a year backlog because of flooding. And one of the domestic appliance manufacturers in the UK, Hotpoint, they had a 6-month interruption on fridges. So the consequence of that business loss as a result of damage from water is far more extreme than the cost of the water damage itself. We also see other parts of impact in the supply chain. So I work with a food company in Italy that very proudly says on its jars of tomato sauce made with 100% Italian tomatoes, they're starting to think in their supply chain, will that still be possible? Not flood-related, it was freeze-related, but one of our clients in Florida had to repackage all of their orange juice as they could no longer say it was Florida orange juice in 2021 as they had to buy from Mexico. So we're seeing the impacts of water causing damage, impacting the supply chain, and many, many different sources of business interruption, some of which are insurable, but many of those consequences are, because insurance tends to focus on the damage element. So where you're not suffering damage, you're just suffering economic loss, it's very hard to get an insurance recovery. So they're some of the key ways we see it as a risk vector. I do think the insurance piece is something that is worth exploring more because there is inadequate insurance available. We're at a time at the moment of all-time, it's the highest reinsurance costs that we have ever seen in the history of reinsurance. And every other time we've been at that highest point, because we come to that highest point every so often. New insurance capital new capital has come into the insurance market to recapitalize and to make our market cyclical, increase in supply of capital and prices come down. We're currently at an all-time high and new capital is not coming into the market, and a lot of that is because of the extent of cat losses and the expectation that they'll get worse. So there's much more I can talk about, nature-based solutions, how insurers are thinking about them, but I want to make sure that John has a moment to speak.
All right, thank you for that, Amy. And I feel like we're really continuing to expand here. We've really taken a lot of liberties with the beyond utilities. We've gone in many different directions at once. John, you represent a couple of different sectors in entertainment, in real estate, and Amy was just enumerating some of the ways that these water-related hazards, insurance, climate disruptions, et cetera, are impacting corporates that she works with. So, you know, as a representative of industry, I'm curious which of those sort of ring most true for you, whether it's thinking about supply chains, whether it's, you know, ensuring adequate supply, or, you know, optimizing water as a resource, or are you concerned about these threats and insurance from disasters? How are these figuring into your work?
So I guess I'd start out by saying all of the above. I am the definition of outside of utilities. So I am a large-scale real estate developer focused on sports and entertainment. I work for Harris Blitzer Sports and Entertainment. We own the 76ers, the New Jersey Devils, the Cleveland Guardians through affiliation, Real Salt Lake, and then recently through affiliation, the Washington, D.C. Commanders. When I think about development of these projects, particularly our arenas, our arena in Philadelphia will be delivered in 2031. So we're talking about large-scale master plan projects 10 to 15 years out. And that requires a whole different set of calculus than putting up one individual multifam building in the next 2 to 3 years. We have to take into consideration climate, we have to take into consideration water, and we have to take into consideration the host of variables, whether everything from location, so that we're not in the floodplain, or if we are, we're thinking about ways to mitigate. And then we have to think about it from our consumer experience and from usage and from thinking of water as a scarce resource. And so we're thinking about it as the full gamut. So I come here with the developer hat, and then I also come here with the father hat, and thinking about kind of the scarcity of resources and what that means for the future of our children. Most today, as we think about 2031, and where we were going to put the 76ers arena, we thought about the waterfront in Philadelphia, and we decided to go in the center of the city. Host of reasons, one of which climate and water levels. I'd like to say that for this audience that was the primary objective. It was not. The other objective in that case was on top of a transit station. So really thinking about how we shift modality from car to public transit and ultimately to other means is kind of our biggest and most important impact on carbon footprint. But then as we think about the venue itself and as we stand up the venue, there we think heavily about water consumption. In our case, more so because of the fans. We tend to see 1 million to 2 million a year of fans in each of our venues, and so we have to think about how we manage water consumption, how we manage efficiency, and how we manage water collection on the one hand, and then on the other hand, how we think about cooling systems, green walls, et cetera, and how we integrate that in to have a product offering for our fan that's also sustainable and that factors in to some of the other elements of risk that have been highlighted here today.
So, John, I want to come back to quickly because you mentioned that there are some really innovative practices at some arenas around the country that are, capturing rainwater or reusing gray water. And could you share an example or two of practices that are really at the cutting edge for water reuse?
Sure. So. I'll go with two. I'll go with one that's kind of a personal favorite in the industry, and then I'll go with one that's a vendor that's here today. Figure I might as well just throw a plug to them. So first, in Seattle, Washington, where the Seattle Kraken play, the venue has been now named Climate Change, Climate Pledge Arena. Okay, Amazon backed it. It was a $500 million naming rights deal. And as condition to that, sponsorship, corporate sponsorship, civic in nature, the venue had to be carbon neutral. And so it has everything. It has green walls, water retention, stormwater reuse, irrigation system, reclamation of gray water, reapplication. My favorite is the capture of rainwater, and the reuse for creating the ice for the NHL hockey team. But when you think about the combination of all of those systems in play, and not only the carbon neutral component, but what they're doing with water, like you're seeing a 90% reduction in water usage compared to other older venues across the country. And what does that translate into now? That's 7 million tons of water. Like we're talking about like meaningful, dramatic impact through applications of kind of current technology and kind of being on the forefront of the future. So I'd say that was my first. The second, I love a plug. Usually if it's for me or my organization, it's best, but Hope, outside, the water filtration and screen. I'm sure everyone here today went to the water tasting, and then if they didn't want to wait on the line or get the glass, they try to figure out how to use the hydration system without having a bottle in hand. A couple of plastic cups behind the bar. That's what I got. But anyways, we also, as part of Harris Blitzer Sports and Entertainment, in the midst of COVID, we took over Woolman Rink. That's the ice skating rink in Central Park. Most profitable concession in New York City, as a matter of fact. We competed for the asset. We took it over in the height of COVID, and we committed to give back all the profits to the city. It's kind of part of one of our broader initiatives around our ice hockey teams and frankly ownership as well as myself. We grew up with our kids skating there. We installed the Hope. Hope is a young company, seed round. We wanted to do a trial with them. We installed the system within the rink, set it up. You can offer reusable bottles. Its filtration system has the screens, so unique advertising model, et cetera, and so can reduce plastic consumption, can create awareness, and can give, frankly, people a better water product as well. That's a model that we like. It's a model that we're now looking at for our other venues, and we think it's a practical kind of consumer application that also ties into kind of water awareness as well as kind of drives adoption for new usage and kind of removes plastic and whatnot.
Well, I think it's pretty impressive that you are not only walking and chewing gum at the same time on multiple water issues. You're also whistling, you're juggling, you're doing, you know, so many different things at once, which is impressive to see how that all comes together in a single facility. Mayor Reynolds, I wanted to kind of use this discussion of you know, facility development to come back to you on infrastructure. And you know, you mentioned using natural infrastructure and the marshes around La Crosse as a way to manage some of these extreme weather events. Could you also talk about how, whether it's, you know, in the Mississippi River Valley in general or a specific example from your city, how these water-related issues are coming into play for real estate development or infrastructure development?
Yeah, so I guess it's all related to floodplain, and as is most, for most communities along the Mississippi River, floodplain is, you know, where we are in relation to how many properties are within the floodplain, how we can remove them from the floodplain, how we do that. Do we retreat those homes from the floodplain? Do we establish, you know, a higher levee system? How do we do all that? We do have, we have this brownfield project, so it's a former industrial site that we have over the last 35 years or something like that. We've done the environmental remediation and put fill on the site and raised it 5 feet above BFE, and it's now, after 35 years, infrastructure. In the last year, we've put infrastructure in there. The water, the roads, and all that kind of stuff, and we've actually sold our first. We just had the plat approved by the state, and we're building our first building there. Here, it's a break ground here in the next few weeks. It's a culmination of decades of efforts by people that have come before me, but the key was all of that was within the floodplain. And we've had to make significant and dramatic adjustments to the elevation of that site in order to ensure that we could develop there. And that's really, that's something that we deal with. That's something that cities all along the Mississippi River, and you know, frankly, river corridors everywhere, that's what they deal with, because that risk of flooding is real. The cost of flood insurance is real. FEMA, believe it or not, is real. Boy, are they. Anybody from FEMA here, by the way? I hope I'm not offending anyone. So those are constant considerations for us. I have 900 or so properties that are in a floodplain that, you know, we have to, that is one of the greatest, the property values are significantly depleted because of that, and it's a struggle for our community to deal with that. But, you know, but every consideration that we make in the future is about how and where we develop or redevelop, and because of the potential for floods.
I think that's a great place for us to come back to you, Amy, because we heard from both you and Raghuveer about the protection gap. You mentioned the lack of availability of flood insurance for many people, and Mayor Reynolds just mentioned that, you know, in these floodplains where these disasters are becoming really more acute and much more visible, such that the market is noticing them and it's pushing down values. How does equity, socioeconomic equity, and other forms of environmental justice come into play here? How do you think about that, and what are some of the tools in the toolkit to address that?
Wow, I think I'm going to answer the question I want to answer rather than the one you've asked, because that's a tough one.
All right. Well, go for it. Go for it. It's too late in the day to hit you with a rough one, so I'll answer however you like.
Because there are so many issues bound up in historic, especially in the US, in the loan practices, and I'm far from expert on them. But I think at the core of that. Okay, so I don't have to. Phew. So in that case, I will talk about kind of resilience generally. How do we make assets more resilient, be they homes or be they corporate asset? And I think we need to think about, especially when it comes to water, we need to think about resilience both in terms of resistance. To what extent can we resist being inundated? And some of those homes, those 900, we cannot resist inundation. So how do we boost recoverability? And so I spend most of my time with corporates. How do I make sure that for those assets that we know that will be flooded in a 1 in 10, 1 in 50, whatever the term period is going to be, how do we make sure that 24 hours later they can be cleaned down and people can be back to work? And a lot of that comes down to not just the way people's own assets will work, but how they're working with the cities and the infrastructure. Because it's not assets that are productive, but it's the people in them. So if the people themselves either can't get to work because they've got to look after their own homes or their families, or they can't get to work because the road network isn't working, then the assets aren't economically productive. I think one of the challenges there when we think about resilience is thinking about what the return on investment for resilience dollars are. The World Economic Forum has a number that says every dollar invested in resilience gives a $13 return. And at a macro level, I absolutely believe that. But being able to say to one of your homeowners or to John to one of his fields that this intervention will have this economic return, the return on investment, the reduction cost of risk is X, is something that the tools as an insurance industry we should be really good at, but we're not good enough at that yet. I should be able to give a very clear statement to homeowners or to corporates to say this investment will result in this financial reduction in cost of risk, which will make it significantly more insurable in the long run. But the equity is going to take more than 5 minutes.
Okay, well then maybe we'll have to save that one for another panel. But that is a pretty arresting figure, 13-to-1 return on resilience. So, you know, we're practically approaching an ounce of prevention does actually give you a pound of cure, right? So for any of you who actually know how many ounces there are in a pound, which I had to think about that one for a while. But so I liked how you framed it as having a real economic return in many cases. And John, I wanted to maybe come back to you to wrap up, because you know, the performance of some of these leading facilities, ones that you're developing, these examples like in Seattle that you mentioned that are really best in class. Obviously, there are a lot of very committed environmental objectives behind that. But where does the sort of you know, profit motive come in, and do those things pencil out from a purely commercial perspective, or is it more complicated than that?
It's certainly more complicated than that, and might need more than 5 minutes. But I'll give it a shot. So arenas and stadiums generally are challenging to finance without public-private partnership. That being said, in Philadelphia, we are privately funding our $1.5 billion venue in Philadelphia. To do that, I mean, we've just seen a dramatic shift in how people consume content and where they go to consume it. And live entertainment has certainly been a beneficiary of a lot of the shifts that we've seen in how media is kind of consumed. I'll save that for a different panel that I'm only adequately equipped to address. As it relates to venues, I think it's driven kind of threefold. So I think one, Sports ownership comes with a form of civic responsibility. In some audiences, I'll liken sports to almost church, a place where people congregate in some regards to share in a unique. And so I think ownership of a team really has a lot of civic responsibility. And so we're seeing owners across the industry step up for important initiatives such as sustainability. So I'd say that's one bucket. I'd say the other bucket, regardless of how it's funded, given the magnitude of these projects, and often they're downtown and major urban centers, I think there's a need for public-private partnership. Maybe not financial, but certainly for implementation and execution. And you see that expressed in community benefits agreements and lease structures and different things like that. And with that comes not only financial obligations, but also responsibilities around equity, as well as responsibilities around sustainability. So I'd say that that's another driving force. And then going back to Seattle, even though we could talk about Milwaukee, Sacramento, Barclays, Clippers, et cetera, each one has an element of sustainability or a package that I think is a model for the future. But going back to Seattle as an example, and we're seeing this throughout the, corporate responsibility and corporate sponsorship and corporate requirement of acknowledgement of sustainability and actions such as what we saw with Amazon and the Kraken, I think is another driving force. So I think you're seeing it from kind of three different perspectives. And then finally, the consumer. Like with increased awareness, you're seeing it with the younger generations now. The consumer is a driving force, and sustainability is a priority. And so everyone else needs to kind of address it, and it's important to do so.
Well, thank you for kind of wrapping it up there for us at the end with those overarching themes. And I just wanted to say your comment on public-private partnership was well taken, because we've embodied it on this panel. So with that, I guess we'll bring the session to a close. Wanted to thank our panelists for today and really appreciate the lively and profound discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you.